Welcome everybody to this second session of Ceramics of the Islamic World conference held at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I'll just start by introducing myself. My name is Marcus Millwright, and in keeping with the thoroughly international character of this conference, I'm speaking to you today from the traditional Lekwungen territories of on Vancouver Island on the western coast of Canada, and we have people joining us from all sorts of time zones today for this session. So the session today is entitled Ceramics from the Medieval Jazeera and Beyond. So we have very much a Middle Eastern focus to the talks today. So what I'm going to do is give you just a very quick sort of set of introductory comments and then something about the format of today's session. So as with so many studies of archaeological ceramics, we have a concern with typology, with dating, and with provenance. And these are, of course, our fundamental characteristics of how ceramics are studied because they form a framework for so much other archaeological work. But I think sometimes these can be seen as an end in themselves, and what we're going to see today is very much how one can move from the careful consideration of these sorts of issues into larger questions, questions about economic formations, about social constructions, about cultural practices. So we see how archaeology and related disciplines are not sort of just satisfied with coming up with these answers about dating and provenance. They move on now to really look at how ceramics can start to illuminate sort of wider aspects of human experience through history. And what we're going to see today also is another strength of this discipline, which is thinking about long-term practices, as we see with settlement patterns and excavated material, and then also short-term practices as well, that sometimes things can occur for quite limited periods of time. So we can look at these different ways of experiencing time. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to have short summaries of the papers. And just to remind everybody in the audience, you have access to the complete papers, the half-an-hour talks. So you'll find the link for that in your pamphlet for the conference. And so today we're not going to be showing the images from that, but I mean, if you want to go back and refresh your memory, then you could actually sort of follow that link again and then watch the talks after this session. So we're going to have those short summaries, and then after that I've got some sort of prepared questions that I'll ask each of the panelists here, and also encourage sort of conversation between our panelists. So that will be the sort of second half an hour, and then we'll move outwards into questions from the audience as well. So we'll be looking out for those, and then I'll be transmitting those questions to the panelists, and again encouraging sort of further conversation. So without further ado, I'll move on to introduce our first speaker, and that's Zohreh Mohammadian Moghaya, and she is at the Glass and Ceramic Museum of Iran, and her talk is Continuing Tradition, a study of 5 incantation bowls in the Glass and Ceramic Museum of Iran.
Hello everyone, and thank you, Dr. Millwright. Continuing tradition, a study on 5 incantation bowls. The museum has 5 bowls which are buff-colored, wheel-made, wide mouth with inscription in black ink inside and back. Previous researchers have proved this kind of bowl is an incantation bowl and had been produced in late Sassanid to early Islamic in Mesopotamia region. Information in the museum about the 5 is different from other museums and research. the title of them show they are Mandaic bowls made in Shushtar in 5 to 7 AH. And the question is, which is correct? In the museum, the five are called Mandaic bowls. It is confirmed. The important reason is one of bowls whose inscription is translated by a Mandaic clergyman. So the language is Mandaic, one of the accents of Aramic ancient language. We can be called the five Mandaic or slash and incantation bowls. Their function has been a magical effect for catching bugs, love, power, and elimination of harmful demons and devilish creatures. The bowls, according to traditional, were buried under the doorway's home for protecting family and building. Mandaean are a religious minority who, who live in the south of Iran by the Karun River. The basis of their rituals is on baptism. They and Muslims are historical neighbors, and Shushtar is one of the Mandaic places in Iran. So the place seems correct. The important question is about dates when they are produced. I checked some of the title in another museum about the bowls and unfortunately to study inconsistencies could not be helpful. There there doesn't exist any laboratory tests either. In this situation, anthropological method can be illustrative. As a minority, Mandaean are unknown, but some anthropological study exists. Previous research helped us know the ritual and found a tradition which is still alive, and the key is Sofi incantation. Sofi is another name of Iranian Mandaic. In the Mandaic culture, such text is called Zaresta. It means to be armed or equipped. According to the meaning, Zaresta is a weapon against evil creatures and harmful evidence in the world that is the function of incantations too. We can call the five incantation bowls. Writing incantation on fabric, metal, ware, etc. by Mandaean is a tradition now. The tradition has continued in two ways today. Faithful Mandaean and clergymen believe incantation is opposite of their religious teachings. They keep religious texts at home to remind and renew the covenant with God. Another group, which includes Muslims, believe incantation can solve their problem. The people who believe magic order and buy the Sofi incantations in Iran. On Instagram, we can find them so easily. They claim Sofi incantation is very powerful and very impressive. Result: writing Zaresta as a magical word on various objects is one of the ancient faiths of human being, which is still believed by some people. According to these results, we can be more sure of the information in identification cards of the Glass and Ceramic Museum of Iran because it is a continuing tradition. Thank you.
Thank you, Zari. And we'll now move on to Vanessa Rose, who is at the Université Paris 1 Pantheon-Sorbonne, and her paper is State of Research, Reconsidering the Corpus of Early Tiles from Samarra.
Thank you. Thanks to the committee for the invitation and the organization of this event. During the 20th century, ceramic tiles were found out in Samarra, Iraq, the ephemeral capital of Abbasid Empire from 836 to 892. They were discovered in the Dar al-Khilafah, the caliphal palace built for the Caliph al-Mutasim. Samarra is little excavated, and the material excavated is little published, without gathering the dispersed corpus. Although the archaeologists' archives remain partially unpublished, unstudied, or little accessible. I wish to show how the tiles from Samarra highlight the historical context of their discovery and how the importance to gather the corpus of tiles offers to understand the production and the setting of the Caliphal Palace. Henri Violet, a French architect, and the German team under the supervision of Ernst Herzfeld excavated the site between 1910 and 1913. In 1921, the British government decided to disperse the archaeological material. Over 20 institutions were involved in the distribution of the material, but the exact number of pieces received and sent to museums is uncertain. For the first time, the tiles of Samarra could be explored in whole, with a gathering of an important and representative corpus. Today, the set of tiles amount to nearly 400 fragments. The tiles are identified in museums, photos, drawings, archives. The tiles are made in glazed molded earthenware and can be dispatched in three main decorative groups. A group of polychrome luster tiles with two different settings, mottled and wreath and bird. A dark brown luster with foliage or unknown settings, and the major group composed of only yellow and green monochromes. This group counts for half of the corpus. These three decorative groups are presented in the V&A collections, which preserve 5 fragments of tiles from Samarra. Few of the fragments of tiles are out of the groups and stayed unique, as one blue and white, one manganese monochrome, some white monochromes, one splashed in amber and green. Luster technique and settings remain the first in the Islamic tiling history. At the same time, monochromes used antique traditions of transparent colored glazed covering. With this corpus of tiles, we could observe the style and settings of Samarra between late antique style, Eastern local style influenced by the Sassanid art, and the new visual identity of the Abbasid period. The setting of the tiles could help determine the use of these pieces. Concerning the use of the corpus of tiles from Samarra, the luster is delicate and the process cost is expensive, so it indicates a wall decoration. The tiles were used in specific places because of the necessity of specific light and angle to reveal the metallic shining effect to the visitor. It is the specular reflection. The little number of polychrome luster tiles fragments makes it complicated to imagine a complete tile setting. Concerning the monochromes, mosaics of monochrome tiles and paving could have existed at the same time in the palace to cover the floor. According to the Herzfeld archives, 3 green square tiles were discovered in situ on the floor of the so-called harem by Ernst Herzfeld. Tiles are part of a complex, exclusive and unique decorative program which took place in the palace and which showed the power of the Caliph. From Samarra, the tile taste and technique disseminated across spatial and temporal boundaries are the remaining distinctive artistic medium of the Islamic world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Now we're going to move on to our third summary, and that's Karol Nowacek, and he's also representing Jason Orr on their joint project. And the paper is a Middle Islamic Ceramicene landscape in the hinterland of Arbil in Kurdistan, Iraq.
Thank you. Our paper focuses on an area in in Iraqi Kurdistan that has long been marginalized in terms of archaeological research of Islamic pottery. The large landscape survey projects of the last decade have amassed a vast amount of new data generated by a unified methodology, which allows us to ask detailed questions about settlement structure and dynamics in a long historical perspective. One such project is the Erbil Plain Archaeological Survey, IPAS, covering a 3,000 kilometer square area in the hinterland of Erbil, the capital of Kurdistan, whose data have been used as a basis for this study. Its aim was twofold. Firstly, it was necessary to establish an inner chronological development of the period under study, i.e. the Middle Islamic period, which we succeeded in doing by analyzing the occurrence of specific wares in the surface collection assemblages. The division of the time period under study into two sub-periods was made possible by differences in the occurrence of two leading ceramic classes of monochrome glazed wares, the so-called mottled green and pale turquoise wares, each of which is accompanied by other specific types of glazed and unglazed wares. The break between the two sub-periods is tentatively placed at the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries. This result is not overwhelming from a general point of view, rather has significance as a first step of regional ceramic chronology. More interesting was the second aim of the study, defining distinct functional categories of Middle Islamic pottery and tracing their frequency of occurrence in relation to the settlement pattern of the region. Four functional categories of pottery are stably present in virtually all Middle Islamic period assemblages and differed from each other by mode of production, distribution, use, and symbolic value, from very rough homemade handmade pottery to cooking ware, standard hard-fired creamware, and various categories of glazed ware. The ratio between the imported status expressing component and the homemade component of the ceramic assemblages showed some probably socially conditioned differences in the agricultural landscape of the urban hinterland of Erbil. On the one hand, we can identify a group of smaller settlements in the peripheral territory of Bashtapa, south of Erbil, about 30 kilometers south of Erbil, that was extremely poor in status expressing pottery. On the other hand, the regular network of large settlements that can be denominated as supper villages or agrarian towns clearly had better access not only to regionally produced ceramics, but also to supra-regional ceramic imports, mediated perhaps through the Erbil pottery market. These sorts of ceramics certainly played specific roles in shaping the habitus and collective identity of the inhabitants. The element of self-sufficiency in the production of handmade wares remains in these settlements, but its role was significantly weakened. In the general scarcity of topographically and economically oriented written sources, we are not yet able to understand these and other differences in the ceramic scene landscape in greater depth. We can, however, compare the picture obtained with a valuable later source, the Ottoman tax register of the Tapu Tahrir Defteri from 15 42. This source depicts Arbil Plain after some significant wave of desertification that must have occurred in the 15th century, and shows considerable differences between nucleated and dispersed settlements, with the large nucleated settlements corresponding to the supper villages of our survey. And this kind of large nucleated settlements were predominantly inhabited by non-Muslims. Thus, it can be tentatively hypothesized that the higher social and property status of residents of nucleated settlements may have been intertwined with their either Christian or Jewish religious identity. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Carol. And our fourth paper is Stephanie Mulder, and she is going to be talking on the ceramics of Balis towards a recovery of a lost heritage.
Thank you, Marcus. And am I live? I can't tell. Can you hear me? Sorry, I didn't get the little red circle around my name, so I wasn't sure. Thanks, everyone, and it's wonderful to be here, and really a pleasure to hear all of your papers. And thanks also to the organizers for putting together such a spectacular conference. I'll just dive right in. This paper presented a preliminary overview, and it's very preliminary at this point, of 12 years of excavation at medieval Balis near the modern town of Meskeneh on the Euphrates in northern Syria, which was undertaken by Princeton University and the Syrian Directorate General for Antiquities and Museums from 1998 until 2010. The excavations brought to light a large corpus of stratigraphically excavated late antique and medieval Islamic pottery comprising tens of thousands of sherds and numerous complete and near complete vessels. The publication will present over 1,000 photographs and drawings of diagnostic pottery that were produced over my 10 years as head ceramicist at the site, as well as statistical survey and recording of over 36,000 additional sherds. Furthermore, an assemblage of one particular type, molded ware, was excavated from a potter's workshop, providing critical new information about the manufacture and production of this type in the form of some 30 fragmentary and complete molds, 2 of them with the artisan's signature. Excavations carried out at Balis in the 1970s included the first ground-penetrating radar surveys in Syria, and they revealed the presence of numerous kilns, but these are regrettably still unpublished. So altogether, this research indicates Balis was a significant production center for medieval ceramics, and that it may well have been, in fact, a production center similar to or akin to some other more well-published sites, such as Raqqa in northeastern Syria. In addition, the ceramic assemblages from Balis were excavated, of course, in accordance with contemporary stratigraphic norms, which means it's now possible to assign secure dates and create clear typologies for a variety of previously uncategorized ceramic types, including the full range of common unglazed buffwares, brittlewares, and other types. So in this paper, I gave a kind of general overview of the finds at Balis, which are now being prepared for publication. In addition to that, so I'd say this paper was kind of organized around 3 themes. One is the necessity of publishing more comprehensive typologies that include unglazed Islamic ceramics, a broad overview of the typology and composition of ceramic materials from Balis, and then lastly, the problem of what to do when the publication of ceramic finds is imperfect because of lack of prior publication or lack of attendant publication of the general excavation report, the passage of time between excavation and publication, and of course, in Syria, the problem of war and conflict. At Balis, as at every site, the vast majority of finds are unglazed common wares, and yet until recently in the field of Islamic ceramics, The majority, the majority of published comparative material for dating are all fine glazed wares. The problem, of course, as many of us know, is that fine glazed ceramics, while making up the bulk of museum collections, typically comprise only about 2% of ceramic finds from an excavation. So what this means is that unless you find fine glazed wares, by no means a given in the excavation of Islamic sites, it's challenging to date levels when you're out in the field. Fortunately at Ballis, the unglazed wares also include the discovery of a workshop for 13th century unglazed molded ceramics, including, as I mentioned, hundreds of sherds of molded ware, over 30 molds, and 2 near complete molds that were signed by the maker, one Ibrahim al-Halabi. The second problem I addressed in my paper, as I just mentioned a moment ago, is how to approach the publication of imperfect catalogs of ceramic finds. Ballis, despite having been excavated on 3 separate occasions, has suffered from a near total lack of publication. In the case of our excavations, our ceramics publication too will no doubt be imperfect because it is not yet clear whether the excavation director plans to publish the site report. And because in 2015, during the war, the site was bulldozed by ISIS and our excavation storerooms were looted and the objects dispersed. Among the lost items was a collection I had compiled for permission to be removed for petrographic testing in the following year, and I was not, of course, able to return in 2011. Nevertheless, I argue that moving forward with even an imperfect excavation and ceramics report is better than not publishing at all. And I plan to do so with the hope that future work at the site can be undertaken under better circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And yes, I think the problem of unpublished archaeology is something which we've all dealt with in different ways. But yeah, if I can now go on to our last speaker, which is Michaela Sinibaldi, and she will be talking. So she'll be talking about her work on the sort of post-classical Petra project. So sorry, I seem to have missed the title here, but over to you. Oh, you're still muted at the moment. Michaela, you're still muted. If you.
Here you go.
Oh, that's great.
Okay. So thank you very much. And so thank you, Marcus, and I'd also would like to thank very much the organizer for their hard work in putting together this really successful conference, but also for inviting me to present a paper on the subject of handmade pottery in Petra. And I hope that the Petra case study that I've been presenting has shown that handmade pottery is so common in some areas of the Bilad al-Sham that if we want to understand those societies producing it, trading it, and using it, its study cannot be really overlooked. So Transjordan, where the percentage of handmade pottery at archaeological sites is normally very high, represents very well this issue. And Petra is really one of the best examples to discuss at the moment, because so far handmade pottery in Petra is normally 100% of the excavated pottery in an assemblage, with very rare presence of wilt-thrown glazed fragments composing the rest of the picture. So this artifact, which has been overlooked for a long time in the wider region when compared to glazed pottery, it's now better studied because there is a, thanks to the recent generation of scholars who are starting to put a lot more attention to these artifacts. But in the past, this gap in our knowledge has supported some big misconceptions, which is the subject of this paper, such as the notion that Petra was completely abandoned after its important phase in the Nabatean and Byzantine periods, and the one according to which the Crusader period always had a deep impact on the Middle Eastern societies. And the association of these assumptions with the fact that almost all the pottery in Petra was handmade and that has been rarely studied in detail has created the misconception that more or less all the pottery in Petra after the Byzantine period was to be dated to the Crusader period. Moreover, handmade pottery from Petra has intense aspects of longevity. So these have reinforced the misunderstanding that all the pottery found in Petra belong to the same period. And on the other hand, such aspects of longevity also led to another opposite assumption that it was completely impossible to distinguish chronologically diagnostic aspects in this pottery group. But both assumptions were actually not based on detailed and systematic studies. And so in trying to understand what were the chronologically diagnostic aspects of this pottery group, I realized that these were generally quite different from those normally used for wheel-thrown pottery. For example, form seems to be particularly challenging to observe in its chronological changes, while surface treatment appears to be the most useful aspect. This also means, however, that unpainted and unslipped ware is currently the most difficult to date. And of course, one additional aspect of such difficulty is the almost total lack of association with well-dated pottery, especially glazed imports. However, by combining stratigraphy and with association with better known fragments, as well as information on a few well-dated sites, it was possible to advance this chronological understanding. So after developing observations on the basis of stratified context, it was possible to attempt observations on pottery from surveys. The results are twofold in terms of diachronic settlement patterns. A feature of continuous settlement in Petra through the Islamic period is starting to emerge. So it is a less drastic and indeed much more realistic situation than the one proposed earlier by scholars. Moreover, results have shown that the Crusader period was not at all the most represented by pottery, but actually it is currently the Mamluk period, which is starting to emerge as particularly visible. On the aspect of methodology, this case study suggested while chronology is still a challenge for handmade pottery, it is indeed possible to start detecting chronologically significant aspects in handmade pottery over time. And this needs to be done through a systematic and detailed analysis, and it is most likely that it's possible to apply this broader methodology to handmade ceramics also from other regions. Thank you very much.
You're muted, Marcus.
Sorry about that. So what we're going to do now is I've prepared a question for each of the panelists. So I'll sort of go back through in the same order that we had the initial presentations, and then we'll open it out to further discussion. So Zoe, if I could start with you. So in metal or ceramic vessels that are meant to have an amuletic function, the placement of text can be as important as the content of the text itself. And indeed, we often see how text is illegible, but you know it's sort of still written on there. So one of the most common strategies in writing text is to create a spiral that contains some central element, and it causes the reader to have to move the vessel in order to be able to read it. So I was wondering, given that you have text arranged in different ways on your vessels, how do you see that the readers would have, or the users would have actually read or worked through the text, and would that have an impact on how they'd be understood? We can't hear you at the moment. Is
Do you want to ask the next question, and we'll try and figure out?
Okay, that sounds like a good idea. Thanks. Yeah. So sorry, we'll come back to you in a moment. But Vanessa, maybe if I can move on to onto you. You provided a really useful survey of the types of luster painted tile from Samara. But I was wondering, also perhaps for the audience as well, if you could talk about whether you think it's worthwhile to use the well-known luster tiles from the prayer hall of the Kairouan Mosque for comparative purposes, and does this provide a wider vocabulary of designs and techniques and help in thinking about how they could have been arranged in interior spaces? And I was thinking of the study that James Allen made of how potentially the tiles at Kairouan could have been made into larger designs.
So my connection is not so great. So your question is about the settings in the palace, right?
And also whether the tiles in the Great Mosque of Kairouan are useful for comparative purposes, or whether you think that they're really very different from the Samara tiles.
So yes, the current corpus is the only one, another one in the 9th century. So it is very important to have to compare the two corpus. They are very different in their shapes first, because in Tehran we have only square tiles, 1 centimeter thin. So it's a big difference with the Samara corpus with different shapes, rectangular, octagonal, square. And in the iconography, the two corpus are very different, because in Tehran we have only geometric and abstract patterns. So it's different in Samara with different iconographical part, with birds, wreaths, mottled. So we have 4 parts animals and 4 parts mottled with abstract pattern. And the other big difference is the color of luster. We have fantastic polychrome luster tiles in Samara, only bichrome or monochrome in Tehran. The other big difference is the presence of monochromes, green and yellow in Samara, but we have some in Ifriqiya, in Rakada or Sabra Mansouriya, but not in Tehran, to my knowledge. So this is the big difference. And unfortunately, it's difficult to compare the two corpus to understand the settings and the complete decorative program in Samara, because they were discovered in different places in the palace. So we could imagine different program in different places. And for Tehran, we know this fantastic mihrab program with the same pattern in all the wall of Qibla. So we are in a religious context in Tehran, and in a secular context, in palatial context in Samara. So for me, the two are very different.
Great, thanks so much. I believe we can go back to Zore. Her microphone is back working. Sorry, would you like me to repeat the question, or are you happy to answer it?
No, I answer. You asked me about spiral method in writing inscription. Yes.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. One of the bowls, number of 16 to 7C, we have that method, a spiral method in writing inscription. The center of the bowl, a small irregular circle with a black line is drawn, and the inscription is started after a short distance from this irregular circle. The spacing between the row is more than another bowls, and the writing direction is clockwise. About relation between a spiral method of writing and concept, I didn't find any evidence. But in all of those, we have a circle after that writing. In another research, it is called cage of spirit or cage of soul, because the function and the function is caging soul or is bad spirit, bad demon in the bowl.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, yes, this concept of trying to enclose things within words is a very powerful one, and so it looks like it's something that goes across the different religious traditions of the Middle East. Yeah.
Yes, it is. And now, today, in Iran, Muslims and Mandarin share this tradition between together. Mandarin are famous writing incantation or zaresta in bowl, in metal, on fabric, for Mandarin and for Muslims. They share this tradition, I think.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So, Carol, if I can move on to you. I mean, you gave a really impressive summary of the distribution patterns of specific wares, and I think also talked about, how we can draw out aspects of status, from them. And I was wondering, in relation to the distribution networks themselves, given that heavy and fragile materials like pottery are easier to transport by water than by land, and does things like use of rivers and canals, factor into how you're thinking about the distribution of pottery in this area, or is that not really a kind of relevant consideration?
This aspect should be considered in the further research, but from the time being, we are dealing with the area which is inland. So the Arbil plain is full of small canals and kahrizes and other waterways, but this kind of waterways is too small, by my opinion, for transporting pottery. Yeah, and especially the area I showed in my presentation is far from large rivers, from greater rivers. So we can omit in this stage this kind of distribution of pottery.
Yeah. So do you think, in terms of production centres, though, I mean, obviously there are good reasons to produce pottery by rivers, because you've got the water, you've got the clay, you've got transport infrastructure there. I mean, is it the case that, pottery is perhaps coming into Erbil and then actually being transported out, or do you think it's sort of coming from, river sort of distribution networks and then sort of coming that way instead?
we are now in an initial state of investigation of distribution pattern of middle and late Islamic pottery in this area. So from chemical and micropetrography analysis, we know that the bulk of glazed pottery from middle and late Islamic pottery has not been produced in Arbil. It was transported or imported from another production center, probably from some center in central Tigris area, perhaps Mosul. We don't know exactly. So in this case, we can consider this scenario of importation here via riverine transport. But for the earlier period, it seems that Arbil was imported. The pottery was imported was partly imported, probably from south, from Samara region and maybe farther south, and part of the wares were produced locally or regionally. So it's hard to identify exact places for pottery production now, even if we made attempt to collect the reference samples of soils from different parts of Arbil plain. But in this moment, we prefer for middle and late Islamic luxury pottery, it means glazed pottery, a production abroad which were imported to Arbil area.
Great, thank you.
If is it good answer?
I think so. Yes. Great. If I can move on to Stephanie now. I was wondering, I mean, you're such a rich assemblage of stuff, but I just wanted to focus in on the relief molded pottery because, you know, it's particularly intriguing with the survival of molds and fragmentary vessels as well. And thinking about that, what we could broadly call a signature on the mold of, it says Naqsh Ibrahim Al-Halabi, if I'm correct. I was wondering if the sort of recent work on the sort of legal dimensions of specific terms in metalwork, where it refers to the making of things, whether you can draw anything from the fact that the inscription notes that Ibrahim made the design. So what does this tell us about his involvement or otherwise in the totality of the manufacturing process?
Thanks, Marcus. That's such a great question. And I love the link to metalware again from the last panel as well, bringing it back to that question, because I do think there always was an interaction between clearly molded ceramics, probably the most obvious example of the types of, you know, visual or aesthetic interactions between these two media, because of their relief quality and the way that that imitates, of course, metal objects. The question of the signature is amazing, and I love thinking about it because although we probably don't yet have enough information to know exactly, you know, who Ibrahim Al-Halabi was, we can certainly surmise from the location of the signature, as you say, Marcus, that there was some type of multi-step process, that there was some type of, let's say, kind of, you know, proto-industrialized process in the production of molded wares in particular. And I don't have images to show you, tragically. If you'd like, you can see them in the presentation, but so I'll just try to describe, but I'll do the hand gesture description. So essentially, the molds, have kind of this half hemispherical form, and around them is actually the design, which can be, in the case of the 12th, 13th century molds that are signed by this maker, is usually incised calligraphic and stamped decoration into the mold. And then the signature is actually, so I have one great example that has calligraphy, which of course has to be done in reverse in order for it to appear in the correct orientation on the final molded object. So the calligraphy is done backwards, in fact, the decorative calligraphy, whereas the signature is placed at the very center, kind of at the bottom of the bowl, and that signature is done in proper orientation, to be read from right to left, in other words. So just to be clear, the decorative calligraphy runs from left to right, and the signature on the bottom runs correctly from right to left, as Arabic does. So clearly this tells us that the signature was not meant to be part of the final project, because it would have been flipped, right, if it were. And it tells us, in fact, that it was meant to be part of the production process. So, so I was thinking a little bit also about Zahra's ceramic bowls, and Marcus, your comment about having to read it and turn it, and kind of handle it in order to read them, and the ways that the structure of the bowl itself shapes your experience of that object and kind of the meanings that can be derived from it. But in this case, it's really clear that this is probably just a maker's mark. And most likely, my guess is that because the production of molded wares is a multi-step process, that the mold itself was kind of a branded object, so to speak. So he would produce, many, many molds, and that was just all he did. He made the molds, and he was apparently famous mold guy. Abraham from Halabi lineage of some kind, Aleppan lineage of some kind, whether he was making them there in Balis or whether in fact they were imported from Aleppo is a very interesting question. That's one possibility. He could be literally Halabi, or he could just be, having that that name, living in Balis, but it raises that question of import as well. But ultimately it tells us that, he made the molds and somebody else probably was making the molded wares, or maybe, who knows, that's his little workshop and he was doing all steps of that process. But it certainly tells us that he thought that this was something related to the actual production, and that he had enough pride in his work, or that it was, there needed to be kind of an accounting of this individual's work in order for it to have that signature at the center. So it's a really rich kind of series of ideas that can be teased out of those molds.
Great, thank you. I mean, yes, there's a masses of work to be done there, and we have from Raqqa molds, but sadly no names to go with them. So actually, except one, which seems to suggest that the mold was actually made in Hira, further south, and then actually either the mold or the vessel was brought up from there to Raqqa. So yes, I think they pose all sorts of interesting questions.
By the way, just as a quick aside, there's in fact another Naqsh Ibrahim al-Halabi mold in the British Museum. So perhaps also taken from Balis, or maybe from Aleppo, who knows.
Great, well, thank you. So if I can move on to Michaela for the last of my questions. Been really interesting to hear about this new work on handmade pottery, because up until relatively recently, I mean, it was seen as something which sort of got started perhaps in the 11th century, and you're pushing those dates further back. And you talked about the implications of that for thinking about settlement patterns, and it put me in mind also of Jody Magnus, who's looked at the sort of late antique ceramic types in some areas seem to have been going into the 9th century. And what that's going to do is where in the past we've tended to see kind of sudden dips in settlement because of the ceramic record, it's going to sort of change that. Do you see that, or do you foresee that this will have implications for how we understand settlement across Jordan more generally, or do you think it's very particular to the Petra area?
Yeah, thank you for the great question. This is a very important point. So yeah, I do not think that is going to be limited to the Petra area, and I think that with time, while scholars are looking more and more at handmade pottery in Jordan, and also while they're changing angle of archaeological methods, like working on materials as a pattern. And I do not think, while the future might not be drastically redesigned, I also think that this vision of in black and white is going to be nuanced a lot more, and as it's probably to be expected anyway. So, and I think behind this, there's really a matter of methodology of work. So one aspect, for example, is working more and more with a combination of sources. So that's something that some scholars have really demonstrated very well, how it's possible to combine strengths and weaknesses of different sources in order to let patterns emerge. It's very important, the collaboration of the partnership of documentary sources and archaeological sources. But the other one is really the idea of an archaeological gap. So whether making a difference between what is a real gap in settlement and what is a perceived gap by our way of looking at things. So for example, I really have to agree with Alan Walmsley's point that a lot of the gap that we are seeing in settlement is really the way that we look at archaeological sources, our limited way of looking at it. So with the example of Petra, I think is quite meaningful, because the documentary sources actually are extremely clear on the fact that the area was already going through a very prosperous phase agriculturally during the 10th century, and then in the 11th century, Wadi Musa is already mentioned as a very prosperous, archaeologically prosperous place. In the 12th century, the Franks mentioned the importance of olive trees, which obviously point to a long trend of cultivation of the trees. So there is really no reason to suspect that, to think that the area has been abandoned for a long time, because it was agriculturally prosperous, but it just disappeared at times from the documentary sources because it was provincial, quite simply. So this is one aspect. And the other aspect is pottery, of course. So as you mentioned, in Petra, I've seen this handmade pottery in association with the 10th century assemblage from the Finnish Jebel Harun, which is dated thanks to imports very well. So this means that we have to imagine that on surveys, a lot of this pottery, which is unpainted, might be understood as, well, either discarded, like not even considered, or confused with some of the later periods or of the much earlier periods, such as Iron Age or Bronze Age pottery, which was the case very much in the past. So I think it's very important to look at this idea of perceived gaps. And already some of this emerges, some of this evidence is starting to emerge. For example, at Aqaba, this handmade and excavation of Donald Whitcomb's, this handmade pottery without any decorations is already present in the 10th century, and other sites such as Khirbet Daria in Jordan, we see that it's already present in the 10th century. So I think we have to think very much in that way. And the same thing might happen for the later periods, where I think that we are also dealing with this plain pottery. So during the Ottoman period, plain pottery, which is unpainted, unslipped, undecorated, that is often overlooked.
Great, thanks so much. I mean, lots of other things we could talk about, and I was very struck with Michaela's comment, and also Carol was saying about integrating in primary textual sources, and this is, I think, something that all ceramicists are aware of, is that we have this other type of record, and yet trying to correlate the very kind of chronologically specific nature of text with the sort of looser quality of the ceramic sort of chronology is quite challenging, but a very necessary thing to do. Now, what I'm going to do is we've got, in our remaining time, we have questions from the audience, and I can see that there's already quite a number queued up here. So I'm going to read some of those out. So what we should probably do is try and keep the answers relatively short so that we can actually get as many of these questions in as possible. So if I can ask you to kind of deal with them fairly briefly. So if I'll start with, there's a question here for Zore. Do you know anything more about the provenance of the bowls, or who the museum purchased them from, particularly those that were not transferred from the National Museum?
I know from 5 Mandai bowls, 3 of them have purchased in I think in 1982, and another one, 2 of another one donated by National Museum. In identification card, just write it. That's all.
Just to follow up on that, we have a second question here, which is, thank you for presenting this suggestive link to current practices among Iranian Mandaeans and other groups. Have you had the chance to look at archaeological evidence of similar bowls from Shushtar and Masjid-i-Jami in Isfahan? They were produced in the Sasanian period and are inscribed in a variety of languages and are similar to your bowls.
No, I have no chance, and my colleague, Dr. Arabestani, have written a book, an anthropological study about Mandaean. I sourced them, and by review from one of clergymen of Mandaean, and historical study. Just
Great, thank you. So I'm going to move on now to Vanessa. There's a question here, and so there are actually 2 questions in one. So first, in the photograph showing glittering mottled tiles, I had the impression to see both golds and blues. Is this mottled luster? Is this how this mottled luster would have looked like? And second, your work on a major site that has defined the canon of Islamic art, and your corpus apparently has no parallels on any sites elsewhere, at least from what we know now. I wonder what strategies that you adopt in your work to mitigate the risk of reinforcing the Samarran bias in our narratives of the 9th and 10th century, and if looking at later and decentralized productions such as the Ghazni tiles might help in this challenge.
Thank you for your questions. First, concerning the photograph with the mottled setting, this is one of the best preserved fragment with an impressive setting with this incredible color with blues and pinkish and so on. This is the mottled polychrome luster tiles in Samara. and with the different quantity of copper and silver, they made these incredible settings. And this is the color in this shining effect with the different angles with. So for the second question, yes, it is the problem of the BS of Samara and this very important site and so on, unique. And so I work on the antique tiles, so the Eastern antique tiles, to compare and to understand the techniques and the use of them. And I use also the Caron corpus, 9th century corpus, and different corpus from Ifriqiya, Rakkada, Sabra Mansouriya, and until the Algerian Kala de Banu Ahmad corpus too, to understand the techniques and the transfer of techniques and the use of their styles, the settings, and how they could be restituted in their original palace.
Great, thank you. So there are two questions here for Stephanie. I'll read them both because they're sort of related to one another. So the first one is, have any of the finds which were looted been recovered? And then also, was there much pottery in the Umayyad house published by Leiston in 2008, or had it been totally cleaned out?
Thank you, Fuchsia and Rosalind, for those two questions. So quickly, the first one, they have not been recovered, and there is some hope that eventually, when I go back to Syria, which I intend to do at some point, there will be a chance of maybe picking up some of them. But of course, by that point, they will no longer be in the configurations in which I had left them, with the exception maybe of some sherds which I may have assigned numbers to. I may be able to reconstitute some of that. Our site watchman is no longer living on the site. He's unfortunately been displaced, and I'm in very close contact with that family still, but they have not been able to get back and see what the status of it was. So the second question, it's very interesting because the Umayyad mansion had been really sort of cleared of a lot of objects. There was kind of a brief ephemeral later occupation that or perhaps kind of post site use for about, we think probably less than about 10 or 15 years. All of the ceramics, though, from the Umayyad Qasr came from these really complex drain assemblages off of the side of the Qasr. And these, in fact, constitute a really kind of intact, sealed locus, a context for Umayyad pottery, I think akin to very few other sites, because they were totally closed off, and it just seems to be solely, you know, a single occupation site. So in other words, what's kind of, we did get some ceramics from kind of the area of the living space of the Qasr itself, but the vast majority came from several drain features that we excavated. And so that makes them really kind of this fantastic gold mine for Umayyad pottery, because it's, you know, it's of course difficult to differentiate, or arguably is not that different than Byzantine ceramics. But if it is, this would be a chance to kind of really pinpoint what that is.
Great, thank you. Now I'm just going to just go slightly out of order now to make sure we get all of our speakers with questions. So there's one for Carol, and I think maybe also Michaela might like to kind of talk about similar sort of issues. And this is the question of the model of super villages is very interesting, and it reminds me of developing models on the Ararat Plain in Armenia. Are there parallel data sources which complement this ceramic data? How does your developing model of ceramic sociality intersect with the broader picture for this relationship in terms of intersite relationships?
I'm not sure if I understand well the details of the question, but I can say that these kind of, let's say, super villages has probably or has had probably a long continuity from late Sasanian or early Islamic period. So in every case, we had occasion to make survey of this type of sites. We see a gradual growth of this kind of settlement from small nuclei dated to early Islamic period, sometimes even 2 nuclei that have been integrated in certain point of development, and they reached about 30, 40, 50 hectares in maximum. So in the maximal point of their extent. So I'm not sure in this moment about. I can't say more about the pottery distribution or pottery distribution pattern, really in regards to this kind of large settlements. But as I discussed or argued in my presentation, I'm pretty convinced that at least part of the luxury glazed pottery and regionally produced pottery, as for example molded ware or cooking ware, it came from the regional market in Arbil, most probably.
Yeah, and Michaela, I was wondering. In Jordan and say the Kerak Plateau, I mean, you see the development of much larger settlements when they're near to trade routes, you know, like the Darb al Malik, or so. Do you see that sort of being a factor in terms of, you know, the types of ceramic patterns that you get on particular sites?
Yeah, definitely. So this the study by Robin Brown on sites on the Kerak Plateau has already highlighted that the results that some there was more abundance of imported pottery in sites close to the edge road, so the most important road by far of the region, and of the overall region as well. So this is I really think that this is a pattern that we probably can see also for other less understood periods, such as the Crusader period. We have a problem with the Crusader period because Kerak and Shobak, the 2 most important sites of the Crusader period in Jordan, have not been excavated specifically for the Crusader period phases. So in Shobak, there is a difficulty in identifying the Crusader phases, in isolating them from those of the other periods, and Kerak hasn't been excavated at the same time for those periods. So, but my suspicion, I very much think that when we will discover that the Edge Road really was very much the reason behind all the imports that we're going to find at these sites, as opposed to sites like Petra. So sites away from the main road have much less of these imports. And I also think that very likely a lot of them came from the western part of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, but also not only during the Crusader period. So by the area of the Gora Safi, south of the Dead Sea, and that some of the types that excavation in Gora Safi found will also be found at the castles, because I really think that Jordan has a strong identity as a region associated to the Hajj road. That's really the main aspects of circulation of pottery. And so actually, I had prepared a question for Carol from this point of view. Like, I'm curious to know how, if I understand well, in your conclusions you highlight that the bigger centers that you're looking at are sometimes associated to a Christian population, but that's not necessarily the all of the centers with the highest amount of imported pottery are along the main roads. So I was wondering how, if you have progressed in the interpretation of this data, if you have some ideas about how to interpret this interesting data, like not distribution of ceramics not along the main market roads.
Thank you very much. I should point out that this conclusion is very tentative, and it came only from the perceived similarities in settlement hierarchy, with very large agricultural settlement on the top, and the plenty of small dispersed villas or hamlets on the second end of this curve, and this settlement hierarchy is reflected. It's seemingly reflected by the Ottoman tax register, with this kind of large settlements settled predominantly by not only Christians but non-Muslims. So it's slightly different from my presentation because the Tahrir Tapu Defteri named directly non-Muslims, not only Christians. So I think in this moment it's very early to discuss this phenomenon in depth. We are in the beginning, but we believe that between the 13th, 14th century settlement hierarchy, which I described, and the Ottoman tax register in mid of 16th century might be some correlation, which is obviously very fragile conclusion.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So let's go back to our questions, and I've got two here for Vanessa, so I'll read them both out. So I would like to ask if you have analysed some of the monochrome tiles that show clear cut parts, the cut that was intentionally made. How do you interpret this? And then I loved your exploration of the spatial implications of the Samarra tiles, considering light and shadow as well as their role in delimiting space. How do you think your analysis of the tiles contributes to a new or different understanding of Abbasid architecture and spatial aesthetics as a whole? So big questions to deal with in a short period of time.
Yes, thank you for your questions. First, concerning the cut marks on some monochrome tiles, according to Venetia Porter, it can be for mosaics on the floor, with some paving and some mosaics could exist at the same time. Concerning the second question, for the implication of the light and the shadow. It is one of my best interests. It's very interesting to analyze the light and to understand the settings in the palace and the different areas where the tiles were discovered, to understand if they are if they moved or if they are in the place where they were originally organized. So yes, I think this analysis of the light, the natural light and the artificial light contribute to a new understanding of Abbasid architecture and this spatial aesthetic. And I can compare this corpus and this place of Samarra with some different places like the Khaled Ben Muhammad in Algeria, with the same question of serdab and the use of water serdab and the different light to show the lost tiles in their original context.
Excuse me, Dr.
Thank you.
Murad. Can I
please, yes.
add one something about Mandai culture? One sentence.
Of course.
Can I? Thank you. Their world is changing too fast, very fast, and maybe in future this tradition will die off. New generation and new version of their Hollywood will die off.
Yeah, you make a very good point, and I mean, something I'm very interested in is craft practices, and we see how so many kind of traditional crafts are struggling, you know, in the modern environment, and so we have a job to do to record and maintain them. So if I can move on now, we have a question which actually is for Stephanie, but also Carol is sort of in this, and I think others could probably talk about this as well. Thank you for reminding us that publishing, even with an imperfect documentation, is valuable and essential. I admit that I myself am guilty of that. A small provocation, if I may, to both Stephanie and Carol, for all of us who have worked in countries devastated by conflicts, and for all of us who work in countries that are now safe and open, but not exempt from geopolitical agendas of our states. What are your personal considerations about mentioning and or omitting the current aspects in scholarly events? So I guess it's sort of mentioning the kind of current political situations when you're working on historical material.
I can start, and Carol, feel free to jump in. Carol and I are actually collaborating on an edited volume right now on, have been working together on an edited volume on heritage in times of conflict. And I actually feel quite strongly about, you know, not obscuring the difficulties and the challenges and of conflict, because they, of course, have always been, unfortunately, part of the story of this region for the last 100 years or so. I think that, you know, for me, I feel a very strong commitment to the people that I worked with in this region and who I still have very close relationships with and follow very closely and do my best to support and help when I can. And, you know, I think of them as colleagues and collaborators in the production of scholarly work. And so, you know, omitting their stories and some of the challenges that we encounter while working together with them to me, would not be an ethical choice. So for me, it's, you know, it doesn't have to be, you know, the foregrounded most important story, but it is an important aspect of what happens, and I think we need to be frank about that. I'd be curious to hear what you say, Carol.
I have to admit that for me it's not easy to formulate it easily. Yeah, it's in some brief statements. So I would leave this question aside. But I should say that the Kurdistan region is now in safety in a relatively good security situation. So we don't have to struggle with the problems as the colleagues in Syria now are doing. So that's a different question.
Does anybody else want to talk about that? Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll move on. We have time, I think, for another question. So this is from Oliver Watson. For the complications that the use of molds can present, it's worth looking at the positive block mold in the Q8 museum. It's already a second generation block used to generate production molds. The existence of finished pieces made from other generations of molds show how complex the production processes can become. It suggests mold making is a distinct craft. Indeed, yes, at Raqqa also we have examples that certainly look like second generation molds as well. Stephanie, do you want to talk about that?
I agree. That's a really spectacular example, and if only we had more. But it certainly indicates that type of, and there are others, but that's probably the most stupendous example that remains to us. So I think that probably the takeaway is exactly as you say, Dr. Watson. The question of this multi-step process of production is clearly evident in an object like that.
Great. Actually, I realised I went over one from Yona Waxman here. Just a comment concerning the question of to Stephanie concerning the circulation of molds. We studied several production sites of molded ware in 14th century Western Anatolia and found no evidence of their circulation according to chemical analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I was just sort of thinking out loud about the possibilities, and I agree with you. I think it's much more likely to be a localized production. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think if you look at texts about workshops, when thinking about tools as well, they were things that were probably actually very valuable and held within workshops. And I would imagine that molds might have been the same. That they were sort of essentially the ownership of the workshop, and they wouldn't have kind of just let them out for use elsewhere very easily. So I think. Yeah, so Mariam was just following up on that. So she says, of course, the results from Western Anatolia cannot be generalized, but at least we had the opportunity to understand the situation there, and also that this specific case, molds were made out of the same clays as molded and other pottery. So if we've got here's a I think we have time for one last question. I have to be very quick. This is from Maria O'Donnell Rosette. Stephanie, are there any Umayyad stratified pottery assemblages published from Al-Hadir site near Aleppo, fully comparable to what you showed from the Barlis mansion?
Yes, and thank you for that. Yes, of course, I'm aware of those. And I didn't mean to imply that this was the only site, only that it's one of the few single occupation stratigraphically excavated Umayyad period sites that we know of. So one of the few would be the way to say that. Thank you, though.
Great. Well, I think we have reached our time now. So first of all, I'd like to thank our presenters for wonderful talks and also for their thoughtful responses to questions. And then also thank you, the audience, for all of the fabulous questions that you brought forward in the last part of the session. So thank you very much.
Thank you.